The year is 1095 CE. We stand at the Council of Clermont. In the audience are all the great names of Europe, secular and ecclesiastic. For a moment, there's a hush. The last words of Pope Urban II's fiery speech extolling nations of Christendom to retake the Holy Land from Muslim invaders hangs in the air. Then someone in the crowd shouts, "Deus vult! God wills it!" The chant is picked up by man after man until the council rings with deafening shouts of Deus vult. Then, out of the crowd, a bishop named Adhemar rushes up and falls to his knees before the Pope, proclaiming that he will lead any willing Christian to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ. And thus, the First Crusade began. There's just a few problems. You see, by this point, Muslims had actually occupied the Holy Land for nearly 400 years, and there was little evidence of the various atrocities Urban invoked in his speech to incite Europe to crusade. In fact, the Church had never seemed very concerned about the occupation before now, and pilgrimages to the Holy Land had continued practically uninterrupted since Jerusalem fell into Muslim hands in 637. So what was really going on? Well, earlier that year, Alexius Comnenus, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that had fallen a long way since the days of Justinian, had sent envoys to the Pope asking for help from the west against the Seljuq Turks. These Turkish Muslims coming out of the east had practically pushed the empire to its limits, forcing them out of nearly all of Anatolia, the traditional heartland of his empire. Alexius Comnenus had hoped for supplies, arms, and a few thousand well-trained men so that Byzantium could continue to serve as the bulwark of Christian Europe against the Muslim East, or really so he could just win this war, retake his territory, and strengthen the empire he was the head of, but, you know, it's all in how you sell it. Well, Pope Urban had a slightly different idea. You see, the Pope wasn't in the most secure position. The Church was basically at war with the Holy Roman Emperor. Another pope named Clement III had been installed in Ravenna, and claimed to be the rightful pope. In fact, Urban couldn't even enter Rome, hence why he was kicking around in France, because the Holy Roman Emperor and the antipope held it against him. So Urban thought, maybe let's unite all of Christendom to fight somebody else. Of course, he never really asked for Alexius Comnenus' opinion on this plan, but we'll deal with that more later. And thus, the First Crusade began. But Urban was a smart guy. He knew how to motivate people. He knew how to gather a force larger and more cohesive than any nation in Europe could muster. He would offer to those who had spent their life fighting, those who had spent their lives committing mortal sins, one chance, one opportunity for absolution. And he would offer that opportunity for doing the thing they did best, going to war. This is the first time a pope had ever done this. Never before had a plenary indulgence been offered for martial action, and this innovation drew a lot of people. And truth is, though I may have my suspicions about some of the motivations of the leaders of this movement, in a world as motivated by faith as medieval Europe, I think that faith and a hope for absolution was the reason that so many people bankrupted themselves just so they could join the crusade. But, unfortunately, this offer was so good that a lot of people who signed up weren't quite the people the Pope meant to get. You see, the Pope had set a date of August 1096 for the Crusaders to leave from Europe, so that knights and barons could get their affairs in order, and so that they could prepare what in the Middle Ages counted as supply and logistics. But that wasn't fast enough for some people. In France, there was a fellow by the name of Peter the Hermit, who began whipping up the peasantry. He talked of the atrocities he'd witnessed in the Holy Land, although there's a fair amount of evidence to say that he never actually went there. And he told tales of his divine appointment by Christ to lead the spiritually pure who would be protected by heaven to Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people left their farms to join Peter, although they had no money for the journey and didn't even know how far it was from their homes in Western Europe to the Levant. Few of them were soldiers, and fewer still even owned weapons. But as Peter preached, word of this peasants' crusade began. And while Peter was still gathering his tide of peasants at Cologne, other groups decided that they were just going to set out on their own. And this is where the People's Crusade becomes one of the most unmitigated messes in the history of history. First, there's the group from France under a fellow named Walter Sans Avoir. They left ahead of Peter and made it through Hungary all right, but when they showed up at Belgrade, the doorstep of the Byzantine Empire, the local governor was very confused. He'd been told that the Crusaders weren't supposed to show up for another half a year at least. And weren't they supposed to be soldiers? This was just a mob led by a few impoverished knights. So, he didn't let them in. He told them he was going to send a letter back to Constantinople, and could they please just wait patiently until he got his instructions in order? How did they respond? By pillaging the countryside. In all fairness to the Crusaders, they were probably starving. They hadn't thought to bring many supplies with them, and you've got to remember, this is spring in medieval Europe. It's not like they had refrigeration and rapid transport. The bulk of the food for the year comes in during the fall harvest, which is exactly why Urban scheduled his crusade to start in the middle of August, so it could be easy to resupply as they went. But by springtime, there's just not very much food around, so it's unlikely the Crusaders had been able to really stock up on spare provisions on their trek through Hungary. So the Crusaders went on a pillaging spree. They destroyed homes and farms. They even came to blows with the local Byzantine garrison. Some of them even went back to Hungary, which they'd managed to cross through before without doing any harm, and tried to loot a local market. They tried, but the townsfolk kicked them out, and the local Byzantine garrison beat them down too. And soon, cowed, these first Crusaders were brought under escort to Constantinople. We'll catch up with them in a bit when Peter gets there. But first we should talk about the second splinter group of the People's Crusade, a group from Germany led by Count Emicho of Leiningen. This count had heard of Peter's preachings and had gathered his own group to go crusade. They were to head off to the Holy Land from Germany, but, well, they only got a few miles before they seemed to decide that, the local Jews are a lot closer and less well armed. And so they went from town to town through Germany, sacking their own cities, slaughtering the Jewish population, and stealing any money they might find. Now, this was opposed almost unilaterally by the Catholic Church. This wasn't at all what Urban had called for. Even if you argue he didn't care about Jews, there's no question he wanted the fighting out of Christendom at the very least. Not only did priests and monks preach against this sort of violence, but there are actually heroic stories of bishops opposing these marauding crusaders and trying to protect their local Jewish communities. The Bishop of Speyer gave them his protection. The Bishop of Worms brought the local Jews to take refuge in his home and even tried to fortify the place. But the Christian crusaders attacked and stormed the bishop's house, slaughtering some 800 Jews hiding there. The Bishop of Mainz did the same, and even ordered the town barred against the crusaders. In fact, there, the local Jewish population even raised a great deal of gold to give Emicho if he would just go away. But Emicho took the bribe, and then attacked the city anyway. When word of the attack reached him, the bishop raised his personal guard and rushed to join forces with the governor's militia and a force of local burgesses, who had come out armed to defend the local Jewish population. After fierce fighting, the locals drove the crusaders off, but the crusaders gathered more men, recruited some sympathetic or bribable townsfolk, and attacked again. This time, the defenders broke and fled. In the aftermath, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. Emicho's band massacred their way through Germany until at last, they ended up at the Hungarian border. By this time, Peter and his crusade had already passed through Hungary. We'll talk about how their trip went next time. But when the King of Hungary saw Emicho's marauding band, he decided that nope, he was having none of this, and refused to let them into his country. The Crusaders decided to force their way in anyway, and promptly laid siege to the Hungarian Christian city of Moson, where they were promptly defeated by the city garrison and slaughtered almost to a man. And thus, the First Crusade began. Join us next time to find out what happens to Peter's band of itinerant peasants, find out what the Pope and the nobles were doing all this time, and watch the First Crusade begin in earnest.